Hi. The original title for this was 5 things to do when things go wrong, and I was having trouble coming up with 5. So my own title for this inside my head is what to do when Doug calls Greg into his office to help with a customer problem. And that's really the kind of the focus of the presentation is how to have your ducks in a row when you call tech support so that your issue gets resolved quickly and successfully. So when I was about 5, my parents left for Central Africa, for Burundi, to be medical missionaries. And that was in the early 60s. And it wasn't unusual back then to see cartoons that involved missionaries in a big pot cooking. And so this naturally worried me when I was 5 years old. So we're flying into Bujumbura, into the airport, and I turned to my mother, who was sitting beside me, and said, "Mom, are they going to eat us?" And Mom just looked at me and she said, "I don't know." Some people might have been frightened by that, but I'm like, well, I didn't have those words when I was 5, but I'm thinking, what casual courage, what nonchalance, what fearlessness in the face of danger. You rock, Mom. So a few years ago, I talked to my mother about this and told her the story, and she said, "I don't remember that happening." And then she said, "I probably thought you said, are they going to meet us at the airport?" The point of that little story is you can have the same set of facts and have 2 completely different interpretations of what's going on. So as a user, our customers have an internal model in their head of what's happening under the hood of VTScada that's quite different from what I as a developer might have. So we have a little issue sometimes of interpreting what the problem is from your perspective into something that we can act on in terms of fixing the code. So first step, this is a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, I hope, for most of you, but there are a lot of things that you can do when you configure your system and set up in the first place to just prevent some of the more obvious problems. Have a UPS. Use the workstation status tag. Has anybody here used the workstation status tag? Does it work out well for you? Is there anything else you'd like to see on it? I'm sure there is, Mervyn. Yeah.
The more the better.
Yes. There's a lot of useful things there that you can alarm. If you have the workstation status tag, for example, you can alarm on how much room is left in your hard drive or how busy your CPU is, things like that. Again, it's a motherhood thing, but more than one server for redundancy. We do a great job of redundancy. Take advantage of it. Put an SSD in your machine. For the price, it's cheap performance, and there are a lot of little, good network hygiene is a good idea as well. I'm sure there are other things. Anybody have some other suggestions for how you configure a clean system? Nope. Yes, Lori.
On that note, with the workstation status tag, I think it would be super if you guys had some widgets that were part of the library
that displayed some of that
yeah,
stuff.
That and the redundancy sample screens. Like, what? Oh, out of the box, here's a page that has it.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
I'll write that down.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. The workstation status tag is is built on top of performance counters that are part of Windows, and it might possibly be nice to expose more of them in the status tag as well. But that's a personal opinion. That's not a prediction about a new feature or anything like that. So things go wrong. First thing you do, reboot the computer. Yes? No? There's a few things it would be nice to do first. The single most helpful thing that you can do is get a crash dump. When you take a crash dump of VTS, I can go and look at it in our source debugger. So, yep. Any of you got kids? Okay, do you read to them? Because that's a great thing to do. I have 5 children, and one of our favorite books for each of those kids was Fox and Socks. So let's have a little talk about Tweedlebeetles. When Tweedlebeetles fight, it's called a Tweedlebeetle battle. When Beetle battles Beetle and the battle's in a bottle, we call it a Tweedlebeetle bottle battle. I've got that memorized because I've probably read it about 150 times. Anyway, where I'm going with that is, have the story, have the narrative there. Tell us from the beginning what happened as things got worse, or how you got into trouble. Like, what changed, what's different now that wasn't the case before. Again, back to my first story with Mom not being sure whether they were going to eat us or not. In that story are the facts that we need to find out what the bug is. So I'd appreciate it if you can just make a point of collecting as much information you can before you call Doug. Or even while you're calling Doug, before he calls me. That would be great too. Just an interesting note, most of you are pretty familiar with your systems, or your operators are pretty familiar with their systems, and a quick look in the HDV at the driver tag itself to see whether something has changed in the way that plot is going, might give you a clue as to what's going on. I mean, and when you pop that up, even a screenshot of that if something looks a little weird also helps. Just every little bit of information you think might possibly be relevant. And the other thing is, before you panic, stop and take a dump. I can't emphasize this too much. So I promised Glenn I would do a little classroom activity now. So I need everybody on their feet.
Yeah.
Why, are you going to eat us or not?
And Pat's going to lead this from the back of the room. So I need everybody's hand up in the air. All right? When I go 1, 2, 3, you go take a dump. Okay, you ready? 1, 2, 3. Take a dump. 1, 2, 3. Take a dump. 1, 2, 3. Take a dump. Good job. Sit down. Thank you very much. That's excellent. And I'm just going to give a quick demo of a couple of different ways you can do that. So if I crank up the source debugger, it's pretty simple. This icon right here will create a dump file for us. Just captures the state of the system exactly. Remember where you put it. Sometimes your system will be so locked up that you can't do anything with it. Heaven forbid that ever happens to you, but if that happens, fire up the task manager, the VTS, and right click. More details. Create dump file is a choice here as well. So even if you're completely locked up, hit that. Now, please remember this location when it pops up, okay? Because I forget where it goes from time to time, and I'm sure you might as well. So when this pops up, please capture that and put it in an email to yourself or something, or an email to Doug. Again, I can load that in the source debugger and find out exactly what's going on from the state of your system. At least I hope I can. And sometimes, because we're redundant and we work in a multi-server environment, even though the problem is manifesting on one machine, it's related to something that's going on a different machine. You know, like your historian is backed up because you've got a slow hard drive, or the hard drive is full, or something like that. So if you have an inkling that it might be a multi-machine problem, try to get a dump on multiple machines, on all the machines in your network. And do it before you reboot your system, if that's at all feasible or possible, because every little bit of information we have helps. And I don't feel like we're necessarily going to get all the bugs out of the system, but it would be really nice to get it to the point where you never notice them. Last thing, this is a very short presentation, but call Doug or Jen. And call them even if you think that restarting your machine will fix your problem and make it go away, because we really, really want to know if anything weird happens that we should be aware of. Call Doug or Jen. You know, the purpose of what I'm doing here is not to cut down on calls to tech support. That is not my goal. We really want to know when things go wrong. And we can always hire more tech support people. In fact, we just did. We hired David and Lay and are training them. So we'll soon have another tech support person in Bedford and one in Calgary as well. But call tech support. Doug's getting smart, by the way. If he thinks that I might not be interested in coming and talking to a customer, he'll walk into my office and say, "You gotta come see this," regardless of what it is, right? And as a developer, you know, short attention span, something shiny goes by, I have to bounce down and see what he's doing. But yeah, I really enjoy. Well, one of the things I enjoy about Trihedral and the organization is that I don't know if you've called somebody's tech support organization and talked to some bozo who really doesn't know anything, has a list of 5 questions that he has to ask you with canned answers, and you have to wade through that process of proving that you're not also a bozo before they'll let you go to their second tier of tech support. Well, that's not the way it is at Trihedral. We have one layer of tech support, and if they can't solve your problem, they will involve the developers. I probably spend 40% of my week addressing support-related issues. And something like 75% of the calls that Doug and Jen get have nothing to do with VTScada. Sometimes it's hard to figure that out off the bat. Sometimes it's really, really hard. And as I said, it often ends up on my desk in that situation. So call tech support. Call them and describe what it is. The other thing is, it's worth a call to Doug and Jen, even if it's not something that you think is wrong with the product, if it's a way you think it might be improved, something that you'd like to see down the road, because all those things get recorded and discussed and prioritized. I mean, we have limited resources, we can't do everything, and sometimes people's wish lists conflict with one another, so you kind of have to do what is going to make most people happiest over time. But we really want to get those ideas. Send your cards and letters, folks. Again, this is kind of more motherhood, because almost everything that we can capture in a log file, I can pull out of a dump. But sometimes it's useful to do something like turn on the VTS trace all functionality, or turn on the TSP trace for the low-level modem tracing, or things like that. I'm not going to go into how to do that, because invariably, if you get to the point where you need to do this, you've already talked to Doug and Jen about it, and they've helped you set up the tracing. But like I said, it's a little bit of a motherhood. Wow. Things like Twilio, which some of you heard me talk about earlier, we implemented that feature so that you're automatically logging all the time. The files age out, so we have up to a week's worth of log files always there in your system. You can turn it off if you want, but it's on by default. Okay, bugs. Interesting thing about bugs. If a bug has been in our code for a week, on average it takes us about a week to find that bug. If it's been in the code base for a year, it'll take us up to a year on average to find it. Just because if it's been in there for a year, it's probably either an unusual situation or not very important, so nobody bothers to call about it or something like that. And if it's been in the product for 5 years, well, it'll take on average 5 years to find it, and I'll be retired by then, so. Just at this point, the presentation is essentially over, except for some examples of bugs that I wanted to talk about that puzzled me, so I thought I'd share them with you. We had a situation where somebody was setting up an application, and they logged in, and when the application automatically logged out on the timer, CPU went to 100%. Yeah, like, what the heck? Digging into it a little more deeply, I found that someone had, when they were logged in, because they were developing, they changed some of the display manager settings, which is fine, you're supposed to be able to do that. But for this bug to happen, when it went to 100% CPU, you had to change the display manager settings. And then, when it logged out, it changes to something called the logged off user at that point. It changes user. But it would go to 100% CPU. And that makes no sense. Finally, after looking at a dump file, I was able to see that there were 2 instances of something that there should only ever be 1 instance of, which is, oh, and the other thing was, it was the alarm, there was a muted alarm. The alarm had to be muted. Now, there's a thing under the hood called the alarm player that handles the muting, and there should only ever be 1 of those. But in this particular case, when the display manager settings were changed, we launched a second instance of the alarm player without killing off the first instance. Now, the first instance became orphaned. Nobody knew where it was or what it was, and nobody was looking after it. It was essentially a zombie module living there. And it would scope in and take the credentials of whoever was logged in and keep track of who was logged in. So when it logs off, when we're logged on, there's no conflict. When we log off, we change to the logged off user, but we've still got this zombie that's pointing at the old user. And they're basically happily sitting going, I'm the mute owner. No, I'm the mute owner. I'm the mute owner. And we just buzzed up to 100% CPU. Just seemed like a little innocuous piece of code, but it took this weird combination of things to make it happen, and then a lot of puzzling to track it down. Another perhaps more relevant one was we had an alarm that like one of the built-in alarms for an analog status tag, and it was active, but it had been acknowledged, and somebody went and changed the set point for the alarm. And when that happened, the alarm notified. And instead of saying what it would normally say, like low or high or normal, it said commissioned on the email message. So it was notifying when we commissioned, and it turned out to just be a combination of things that we have lists internally of alarms that need to be notified, and it was being added to the notify list when it was configured because it was active, even though it shouldn't have been. Very simple fix, but an unusual circumstance, and it took an alert customer spotting that they had in fact gotten a notification with this weird text in that said configured instead of off or normal. So that's two examples. I could probably go on in excruciating detail. I've actually got one more. Someone had set up rosters in an area, and while they were configuring their system, they got into a state where alarm notifications stopped completely. Well, it turns out that there were two rosters in the area that the alarms were in, and the alarm manager server was not the alarm notification server. On the alarm manager server, they had turned off auto deploy, and they had turned off the active roster, and deleted the other roster, turned the active roster back on, then turned on automatic deploy. And the net result was that alarm notification didn't think it had a roster. So everything was trickling out to the default roster, which didn't have any context configured. And we could see what state it was in from looking at the dump file, but we couldn't figure out how it had gotten into that state. And it wasn't until I was, spitballing about what things I could do to make that happen and get in that state that we called the customer back and said, "Were you doing some configuration with auto deploy turned on with the rosters?" He said, "Yeah." And it's like this weird combination of things that we would never have thought to test for resulted in this bug that looked like the system had come to a complete standstill and wasn't notifying anything. So that's the kind of thing that crosses my desk. And if you can do things like get a crash dump when things have gone sour and get us a change set, although change sets don't have the same time urgency in terms of, I need the crash dump when things are in a bad state. Whereas the change set, well, it's good to have because we can go back and see what changed. If the configuration changed before the problem started to occur, or things like that, it's good. It's also good to have the change set at that point.
How much history does the crash dump has?
History?
Yeah.
It depends on what you're looking at. The modem manager keeps about 1,000 records for what's happening with the modem. The internal VTS trace, which tracks RPC communications and a few other things, also has about 1,000, although I believe it's configurable. The Twilio, again, is configurable, but he normally keeps about 100 records internally before it spits it out to a file. And there are a few things deeper in the code that I have to pull up the C++ tools to get at. Like again, on the modem manager side, there's a circular buffer that's only holds about 10 events, but it's usually enough to give us a clue as to what's going on. But the important thing for me is that I can see things in process, like internal queues, like history queues and alarm notification queues and things like that. I can catch them in the act if things, if things have backed up. There are a few external things that are also helpful, like actually I can see those internally too. But the alarm state file represents something called an anti-list. And an anti-list is something that we keep track of when an alarm record is deleted before it's like if a client server or a backup server gets a notification that an alarm has been deleted before it gets the notification that it's been created. So an out of order sequence of records. And those anti-lists should never have more than half a dozen things in them ever. So for example, in a dump file, I can look at that and say, oh, there's 1,000 records in there. Something is seriously wrong with the RPC communications and the historian organization. But I guess the short answer is it varies depending on what subsystem I'm looking at. I think that's just about it, folks. Thank you very much. I'm here to field some questions for a few minutes. I think we're going to open it up and do the closing.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you,
So,
Craig.
yeah. Thank you. Thanks, guys.